There is a number that most people will never calculate for their own lives, and it is this: how much of every dollar you hand over for a service actually reaches the person who did the work. You assume it is most of it. You assume that when you pay $90 for something that took 20 minutes and used $12 of material, someone is getting rich. That assumption is wrong almost everywhere in the economy, but nowhere is it more dramatically wrong than in an industry that touches nearly every household on Earth and yet remains almost completely misunderstood from the outside. We are talking about the business of keeping machines alive. Specifically, the business of repairing the vehicles that carry entire economies to work every single morning. Picture the scene. Most people picture it. A building with a few bays, some hydraulic lifts, a handful of workers in stained coveralls, and an owner somewhere in the back doing what looks like very little while money quietly piles up. This image is comforting because it is simple. And simple stories are what our brains reach for when we do not understand a system. But simple stories are usually wrong, and this one hides something important about how capital, labor, and risk actually interact once you step past the surface of a transaction. Underneath the sound of impact wrenches and the smell of brake dust is a financial machine every bit as intricate and every bit as fragile as anything you would find on a trading floor. Start with the scale, because scale is where most people lose perspective. In the United States alone, there are roughly 160,000 independent establishments dedicated to repairing vehicles, generating something in the neighborhood of $115 billion a year in combined revenue. That is not a small industry. That is a sector larger than many entire national economies. And yet, despite all of that revenue flowing through the system, the person who owns the building, who signed the lease, who bears the legal liability, who wakes up at 3 in the morning wondering how payroll will clear on Friday, typically walks away with somewhere between 10 and 20 cents of every single dollar that enters the register. Some months less. This is the paradox sitting at the center of the story: an industry drowning in revenue and an ownership class that is, more often than the outside world realizes, one bad month away from serious trouble. To understand why, you have to stop thinking about repair shops as one single kind of business, because they are not. They are a spectrum. And where a business sits on that spectrum determines almost everything about its financial destiny. At one end, you have the small neighborhood operator, competing purely on price against every other shop within a 5-mile radius, often clearing single-digit to low double-digit margins because the customer has no loyalty and every competitor is one search away. At the other end sits the specialist shop working exclusively on high-performance European machinery, where customers are not comparing prices because trust and expertise, not convenience, are what they are actually purchasing. That shop can clear margins 2 or 3 times higher than its neighborhood counterpart doing similar physical work, because it has repositioned itself outside the commodity trap. This is not a small distinction. This is the entire difference between a business that survives and a business that compounds. Now think about what it actually costs to enter this world in the first place, because this is where the myth of easy money starts to collapse. Before a single customer walks through the door, before a single wrench turns, an owner is already staring down a decision that will define the next decade of their life: buy the real estate or rent it. Almost everyone rents, because commercial property in a location with enough visible traffic to sustain a repair business is extraordinarily expensive, and the irony is that visibility itself is a form of currency. A shop sitting on a busy corridor where thousands of cars pass daily will generate meaningfully more walk-in business than an identical shop tucked into an industrial park 2 streets away, doing the same quality of work at the same prices. Visibility is decoration. It is customer acquisition, paid for in rent instead of advertising, and most new owners underestimate how much that line item alone shapes their fate. Once the lease is signed, the real spending begins. And here is where amateur financial planning quietly destroys otherwise promising businesses. The building has transformed. Concrete floors need reinforcing to handle the weight of multiple lifts holding vehicles that can weigh over 2 tons each. Electrical systems need upgrading to handle equipment that draws far more power than anything in a typical retail space. Compressed air systems need installing because nearly every tool in the building depends on it. Waste oil containment systems are not optional. They are mandated by environmental regulators, and the fines for cutting corners here are not symbolic. They are the kind of number that can wipe out a year of profit in a single violation. By the time the space is actually functional, a mid-sized operation has often somewhere between $200,000 and well over $600,000. And that figure does not include the inventory sitting on shelves or the operating cash needed to survive the first half year while the customer base is still being built. This is the quiet truth about small business ownership that almost never makes it into the fantasy. The money goes out in enormous, front-loaded waves long before it ever starts coming back in. Then there is the equipment, and this is where the fantasy of the wrench and jack garage completely falls apart. A single hydraulic lift, the device that raises a vehicle so a technician can actually work beneath it, costs somewhere between $4,000 and $15,000 depending on capacity, and a functioning shop needs several of them, because each lift is essentially a unit of productive capacity. An idle lift is not neutral. It is a bay generating exactly zero revenue, while the rent clock keeps running underneath it regardless. Add a diagnostic scanner capable of communicating with the dozens of computerized modules inside a modern vehicle, and you are looking at another $5,000 to $25,000, a piece of equipment that, unlike a lift built to last 2 decades, becomes technologically outdated within a handful of years as manufacturers roll out new architectures. Tire changers, wheel balancers, refrigerant recovery systems mandated because modern coolants cannot legally be released into the atmosphere. Brand-specific proprietary tools for certain manufacturers, all of it stacks up until a properly equipped operation has quietly spent well over $150,000 on hardware alone before a single software subscription, keeping that hardware relevant, has even been paid. Here is the deeper truth hiding underneath all of these numbers, and it is worth sitting with for a moment because it says something about the nature of modern capitalism itself. A vehicle today is not a mechanical object in the way it was 50 years ago. It is a rolling computer network, communicating across dozens of interconnected modules, governing everything from the engine to the cameras that keep it centered in its lane. A business that cannot speak that computer's language cannot survive in this industry anymore, no matter how skilled its mechanics are with a wrench. This is the same story playing out across nearly every traditional industry on Earth right now. Physical skill alone is no longer sufficient. Technological fluency has become the actual price of admission, and the businesses that refuse to pay that price are quietly being sorted out of existence by the market, often without even realizing it is happening to them. Now shift to the human cost side of this ledger, because labor is where the most dangerous miscalculations happen. According to federal labor data, the median annual wage for an automotive technician sits around $50,000, with master-certified technicians reaching $60,000 to $85,000 and beyond in high-demand markets. But here is what almost every new owner gets catastrophically wrong. That salary number is not what the technician actually costs the business. Layer on the employer's share of payroll taxes, workers' compensation coverage priced higher because the job carries real physical risk, health benefits, retirement contributions, and the continuous cost of retraining a workforce that has to keep pace with rapidly evolving vehicle technology, and a technician earning $30 an hour on paper is actually costing the business closer to $45 for every hour of work they produce. And that number only holds if the technician is actually productive, which brings us to one of the most quietly devastating metrics in this entire industry: utilization. A well-run operation aims for its technicians to be billing roughly 90% of the hours they are paid for. That sounds achievable until you understand what eats into that number in the real world. Time spent waiting for a part to arrive. Time spent searching for a tool that someone else left in the wrong drawer. Time spent in brief meetings, filling out paperwork, dealing with a customer dispute. None of that is billable, all of it is paid, and when utilization drops from 90% down to 70%, the business is not losing a small sliver of margin. It is losing a substantial share of its entire profit engine, while the fixed costs of rent, insurance, and wages keep marching forward exactly as before. This is the same mathematical trap that destroys hedge funds, factories, and airlines. Fixed costs, whether your asset is being used efficiently, they accrue on the clock, indifferent to performance, and the gap between full utilization and actual utilization is where profit quietly bleeds out unnoticed until someone finally looks at the books and asks where the money went. There is also a second, more human layer buried inside labor economics that rarely gets discussed. Skilled technicians, particularly master-level ones, often build something closer to a personal client base than a simple employment relationship. Customers return because they trust a specific person's hands, not necessarily the name painted on the sign outside. When that technician leaves for a competitor or opens their own shop, a portion of that revenue sometimes leaves with them. This is a version of a phenomenon economists recognize across many service industries, from private banking to law to medicine, where the relationship, not the institution, is the actual asset. Owners who understand this invest heavily in retention and shared ownership incentives, because losing a top technician is never just a staffing problem, it is a customer attrition event wearing a staffing costume. Now consider how revenue actually gets generated, because there are really only two engines driving the whole machine: labor and parts, and understanding the psychology behind each one reveals something important about how pricing power actually works in any service economy. Roughly half of all shops charge somewhere between $120 and $160 per labor hour, with premium urban operators pushing well past that. But here is the trap almost every new owner falls into. The posted hourly rate is a fantasy number until it survives contact with actual utilization. If your rate is $150 an hour, but your technicians are only 70% efficient, your true effective rate collapses to a fraction of what your price sheet claims. And the gap between the number on the wall and the number in the bank account is exactly where profitability quietly disappears without anyone noticing until it is too late to fix cheaply. Parts operate on a completely different psychological mechanism, because markup here is less visible to the customer and therefore easier to sustain. A filter costing the shop a few dollars might sell for 2 or 3 times that. A set of brake components purchased wholesale might be marked up by 100% or more. This is not dishonesty, it is simply how distribution economics work in nearly every retail category on earth, from pharmaceuticals to fashion, where the wholesale to retail spread funds the overhead the customer never sees. The most financially interesting repairs are not the dramatic ones. Diagnostics, the simple act of identifying what is actually wrong with a vehicle, often generates the healthiest margins of all, because the primary input is pure expertise with almost no parts cost attached. Meanwhile, tires, ironically one of the most visible and frequently purchased items, generate some of the thinnest margins in the entire industry, because pricing has been ruthlessly commoditized by online comparison shopping. Smart operators understand this and use tires almost as a loss-leading gateway, a way of getting a vehicle physically into the building so a trained eye can spot the more profitable brake, suspension, or alignment issue lurking underneath. And this brings us to what might be the single most underrated financial concept in this entire industry: the humble oil change. On its own, it is barely profitable, sometimes not profitable at all once labor and fluid costs are accounted for. But that misses the point entirely. An oil change is not a product. It is a recurring appointment, a reason for a customer to physically return to the 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a year. And every single one of those visits is an opportunity for a trained technician to spot the beginning of a much larger, much more profitable problem before it was a roadside emergency. A customer who comes in for an $80 oil change today might leave 6 months later having authorized a $1,200 suspension repair, not because they were upsold aggressively, but because a worn component was caught early during a routine inspection. This is customer lifetime value in its purest, most literal form, and it mirrors a strategy used across almost every subscription business on Earth. The entry point does not need to be profitable on its own. It needs to create a durable, trusted, recurring relationship, because that relationship is the actual asset being built. There is a deeper economic pattern hiding underneath this entire industry, one that connects directly to how entire national economies behave during periods of stress. Auto repair, as a category, tends to be remarkably resistant to recessions, and understanding why reveals something important about consumer psychology during uncertain times. When economic conditions tighten, people do not stop needing transportation. What changes is their willingness to take on new debt for a replacement vehicle. Instead of financing a new car, they choose to maintain the one they already own for another 2, 3, sometimes 5 additional years. This behavior shows up again and again throughout economic history, in downturn after downturn, and it means that repair shops, unlike car dealerships, often see demand hold steady or even increase precisely when the broader economy is contracting. This is the kind of countercyclical insight that professional investors spend careers hunting for, an industry whose fortunes move in the opposite direction of consumer confidence rather than in lockstep with it. Inventory management is where the industry's least visible but most dangerous risk quietly lives, and it deserves far more attention than it typically receives. Every part sitting unused on a shelf is capital that has left the bank account and has not yet returned, frozen in physical form, depreciating not just in value, but in relevance as vehicle models change year after year. With thousands of distinct vehicle configurations on the road at any given time, a part that fits one specific model from one specific year may be functionally useless for anything else in the building. Overstock and cash gets strangled slowly, invisibly, month after month. Understock and something worse happens. A technician to vehicle a part discovers mid-repair that the necessary part has to be ordered, and that lift, that entire bay, that unit of productive capacity, goes completely dead for hours while the meter of fixed overhead keeps running regardless. This is a smaller, more physical version of exactly the same working capital tension that plagues manufacturers, retailers, and even governments managing strategic reserves. The constant, unresolved battle between holding enough to avoid disruption and holding so much that capital becomes trapped and unproductive. Beyond rent, wages, and inventory lies a long tail of costs that new owners chronically underestimate, and each one carries a story about how modern regulation and risk have reshaped small business economics. Commercial electricity bills climb into the thousands monthly once you account for hydraulic lifts, industrial air compressors, and full shop lighting and climate control. Insurance requires not just general liability but a specialized endorsement covering damage to customer vehicles while they sit in the shop's physical care. Because a single electrical fire near a fuel line could destroy multiple customer-owned assets worth hundreds of thousands of combined dollars in a matter of minutes. Hazardous waste, used oil, spent coolant, old batteries, must be documented and disposed of through licensed contractors, with regulatory fines reaching well into 5 figures for a single violation. Software subscriptions for repair databases and wiring diagrams now cost real money per technician, per month, because information itself has become a recurring operating expense rather than something owned outright. And in a digital-first world, a shop with no online presence, no consistent reviews, no functioning website, becomes functionally invisible to exactly the customers it needs most, turning marketing from a discretionary expense into a survival cost. This is where the story turns from operational detail into something closer to a cautionary tale about human psychology under financial pressure, because the way businesses actually fail in this industry rarely resembles a single dramatic collapse. It looks, almost every time, like a slow accumulation of small, individually survivable mistakes. It typically begins with an owner, often an excellent technician who built the business on raw skill, treating the business bank account as an extension of their personal finances. When cash flow is healthy, this feels harmless. Then a hydraulic lift needs an expensive repair, or a key technician quits and has to be replaced by someone who needs weeks to reach full productivity. And there is no reserve built to absorb the shock, because none was ever intentionally created. This is not a story unique to auto repair. It is the same behavioral pattern that has driven corporate bankruptcies, sovereign debt crises, and personal financial ruin throughout history. Healthy cash flow creates a false sense of permanent stability, and false stability discourages the very discipline that would have protected against the eventual shock. The pricing mistake compounds this danger further, and it reveals something important about competitive psychology in any market. Many owners set their prices by simply glancing at what competitors charge nearby, rather than calculating what their own specific cost structure actually requires to remain solvent. A shop might charge a rate that looks perfectly reasonable next door, without realizing that their own fully burdened labor costs, their own rent, their own overhead demand a meaningfully higher number just to break even sustainably. The math can look acceptable for months, sometimes years, until one slow period, one unexpected repair, one shift in local competition reveals that acceptable was never actually safe. It was simply survivable under ideal conditions that were never guaranteed to continue. Roughly half of small automotive repair businesses do not survive their first 5 years, and the uncomfortable truth is that this failure rate has almost nothing to do with a lack of customer demand. Vehicles keep breaking down regardless of the broader economy. What actually fails these businesses is the gap between being an outstanding mechanic and being a disciplined financial operator, two entirely different skill sets that society tends to assume come bundled together, when in reality they almost never do. Look now at what a realistic mid-sized operation actually earns, because the range between a good year and a difficult one is far wider than most outsiders would ever guess. A 6-bay shop running 3 full-time technicians at industry average throughput might process somewhere around 280 vehicles a month, generating roughly $100,000 in monthly revenue. Under favorable conditions, strong technician efficiency, healthy margins, controlled overhead, that shop might deliver an owner somewhere between 15 and 20% net profit, translating to annual earnings in the range of $180,000 to $240,000. Under realistic, unglamorous conditions, one technician running below optimal efficiency, one slow month triggered by a competitor's promotion, one expensive warranty comeback, that same business might see its margin compressed down to somewhere between 8 and 12%, cutting annual owner earnings roughly in half. The swing between those two outcomes at a single mid-sized location can easily $100,000 in a single year, and that entire gap is